Thank you very much. Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be back at UC Santa Barbara, a place where, in a real sense, I started my writing career. Those of you who heard me 2 years ago know this story. I was here as a high school junior for a summer session working on what was then called the Gaucho, the student newspaper. We high school students were called bubblegummers, and that's where I got my first byline here on campus. I want to thank Professor Hecht for a very warm welcome that really makes me blush to be welcomed so grandly, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm here, as Professor Hecht has told you, to talk about a remarkable, enduringly important figure, a seminal figure in our Western tradition, not only our religious traditions, but all of our culture begins in some fundamental way with the biblical figure of David. History and literature, the writing of biography, psychology, politics, all of it is imprinted down to this very day with impressions made by the biblical figure of King David. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to invite you to join me in the process of excavating through these very familiar texts of the Bible to find, as I put it in the subtitle of my book, the real life of the man who ruled Israel. It is especially timely to ponder and investigate David in the political climate in which we find ourselves. I'm always amused, I have to say, as I watch the coverage of the presidential campaigns, at how the candidates are literally climbing over each other's backs to proclaim family values and to condemn sex and violence in the media and to hold up the Bible as the font of those values. As anyone who's opened any of my books knows, there is more sex and violence in the Holy Bible than you'll find in any rap song or Hollywood movie. And the greatest concentration of this sex and violence is focused right in the life of King David. And as we get a little deeper into this subject, you will see, I hope, why that is so richly ironic. Precisely because David plays such a crucial role in the very existence of the Bible. And we'll get into that in a moment. I also want to say, by way of preface, that when we excavate these texts, when we dig through the layers of narrative that we find in the Hebrew Bible, we first come to the highest level, the newest level. We find the theological David. David as a man after God's own heart. David who's given ornate and pious speeches to recite to God. But as we dig deeper, the theological layer presents itself as an overlay and almost a scrim behind which the real David is hidden. Because the real David, the David who is the subject of the original biography at the core of the Bible, is an extremely worldly man. His life is almost entirely devoid of any intervention by God. Nowhere in the life of David do we find the kind of intimate contact with God, for instance, that we find in the life of Moses, a man who the Bible tells us was privileged to speak to God face to face, even mouth to mouth, as a friend speaks to a friend. In David's life, we find a man who is chillingly modern, chillingly like us, because he's a man who is forced to contend with a silent God, a God who never speaks to him directly. And so it's possible to read the life story of David as an account of a man entirely apart from God, someone who makes his own destiny, someone who has the drive and ambition, the ruthlessness, the cunning that is required to conquer a kingdom and then an empire, all without any recourse to the Almighty. This may be a surprise when we reflect on the fact that this story is told within the Bible, which we are taught to regard as a book of moral instruction. But at the heart of the Bible is this flesh and blood figure who moves through the world very much like we do. I also want to pause on another irony. Last year we saw this white-hot scandal in politics, in the media, over the sexual misadventures of Bill Clinton. And we learned a lot, maybe we learned more than we really wanted to know, about what went on in the Oval Office between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. An overlooked detail, and it happens to be one that I ponder in my book, King David, is the fact that at the worst moments of this family crisis, a private family scandal made completely public. And I'll ask you to keep that in mind, because David's life story, too, can be seen as a series of private family scandals made fully public. At a particular moment, the Reverend Jesse Jackson was invited to the White House to minister to the first family. Jesse Jackson knows his Bible, and he chose as his text for this session the 51st Psalm. Now, David is, among many other things, described in the Bible as the sweet singer of Israel. By tradition, he's credited with the authorship of the Psalms, although scholarship suggests that that may have been merely an effort by later biblical authors and editors to clean up the sometimes scandalous image of David that we find in the book of Samuel. But each of the Psalms is traditionally explained as related to an event in the life of David. The 51st Psalm specifically is understood to be David's prayer of repentance for his sin with Bathsheba. And this is the sin that Jesse Jackson invokes to the First Lady. What was the sin of David with Bathsheba? Well, this was the centerpiece of his life story. It's literally the turning point of his life story, the point at which his rise to power, unbroken, subtly tilts into decline. And from the moment that he conducted his love affair with Bathsheba, his fortunes changed in a very dramatic way. What was his love affair with Bathsheba all about? Well, I'll pause and recap it. It is, of course, a very familiar story. David, we are told, is idling on the palace roof, taking the evening air, the evening breeze. Very significantly, his army is off at war with the neighboring kingdom of Ammon. David was a fighting king. David was a war hero. He first came to prominence. He is first introduced in the Bible as a war hero. But at this point in his life, he declines to go to war. He stays behind in the palace while the army goes off to fight. On the palace rooftop, from the palace rooftop, he spies a woman bathing naked on the next roof. This is the beguiling Bathsheba. He sends for her. She is brought to his bedchamber. They engage in what today we would call a one-night stand, a night of love. And like many other lovers, they are caught out by the fact that Bathsheba is pregnant from this encounter with the king. A deeply embarrassing situation because she's married, and married, in fact, to one of the soldiers in the king's army, one of his most prominent warriors, who's off fighting the king's war for him in far-off Ammon. And David decides that he must create what the CIA used to call plausible deniability on the subject of this embarrassing pregnancy. And he does this by contriving to put the husband, his name is Uriah, in bed with his wife, so that when her pregnancy begins to show, there will be a plausible reason to believe that Uriah was the father of the baby. In what is narrated in the Bible as a moment of burlesque, one of the secrets of the Bible is that it is a much funnier, broader, more ribald book than we are ever taught to believe in Sunday school or Bible study class. And we're given the scene of Uriah, the faithful soldier, being encouraged by David to go and take comfort with his wife, to go sleep with her. And Uriah, faithful as he is, stalwartly refuses to do so, saying in one of the many, many moments of real poignance and grace in the Hebrew prose, protesting to the king that as long as the army of Israel sleeps under canvas, he will not sleep under the roof of his own house. Sleeping under canvas in the sense that they are camping out in tents on the fighting front in the war that they are fighting for the king. David does his best to induce Uriah to go home and get into bed with Bathsheba. He refuses again and again. David gets him drunk. That doesn't work. And finally, David decides to resort to a different expedient. He writes a secret order, seals it, and hands it to Uriah. You can go back to the front now. Please present this order to your commander. He trusts the faithful Uriah not to open this order, and Uriah does not open the order, which commands his general to place him where the fighting is fiercest, and then to fall back, to pull back the rest of the Israelite army, and to leave Uriah alone in the heat of the battle and allow the enemy to take his life, thus ridding David of the embarrassment of a cuckolded husband whose wife is now carrying David's bastard child. Now, let's go back to the White House. What is Jesse Jackson telling Hillary Clinton when he invokes this scandalous sin, which starts in adultery and includes the birth of a bastard child and ends with the murder of the cuckolded husband? I think he's saying to Hillary, well, come on now, what Bill did wasn't all that bad. And in fact, what I write in my book is that compared to David, a man described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart, compared to David, Bill Clinton, after all, is just a choir boy. Now, I'm going to invite you to join me in an exercise of decoding the meanings of the Bible in a way that is a little different than the best-selling book of a few years back you may have seen called The Bible Code. The Bible Code proposed that if you took all the Hebrew letters in the Bible and removed all the spaces and fed them into a computer and performed a letter-skipping code, take every fifth letter, every seventh letter, every 10th letter, in the jumble of letters that would be produced, you could discern here and there a word. And it was the premise of the author of the Bible Code that these words constituted divine prophecy that was written into the text of the Bible in distant antiquity and was awaiting the invention of the Pentium chip so that we could understand these prophecies. Now, I don't believe that there is such a Bible code, but I do believe there is another Bible code, and I'm going to introduce it to you tonight. Professor Hecht referred to a theory that is the key to unlocking this Bible code. It's a key to unlocking who David is and why he is written about as he is in the Bible. The theory, one of many I want to concede, one of many different and contending theories of Bible authorship, starting with one theory, of course, which proposes that the Bible is simply the revealed Word of God, and that God is the author of the Bible, but ranging over a great many other theories. One of those theories proposes that the first formal text of the Bible to be reduced to writing is the biblical life story of David as we find it in the book of Samuel. We are asked by this theory to imagine a moment during the reign of King David, or perhaps a bit later during the reign of his son Solomon, when Israel had been transformed from a ragtag coalition of warring Bedouin-like tribes into what was then a modern state, a kingdom, an empire. And it's something that we can understand by reference to other cultures, other places around the world in which a primitive society is dragged into modernity by a powerful ruler who takes his people from a primitive state of existence into a modern state of existence. This is what David did for ancient Israel. Within that world, we're asked to imagine that there is a chronicler, a scribe. Bible scholarship calls him the court historian, who lives and works within the court of King David and is simply overwhelmed, awestruck by what he has witnessed with his own eyes in his own times, is enthralled by David, and is moved at this crucial moment in history to write the story of David down on paper, on papyrus, on parchment. This is, according to the theory that I'm presenting to you, and it's the theory that I embrace in my book, the beginning of the Bible. Around that text, the court historian's biography of David, layer upon layer was added as the centuries and millennia passed. Another writer known in scholarship as the Yahwist or J, possibly a woman, according to this theory, may have been a contemporary and even a colleague of the court historian, working side by side with him to provide the prequel, the backstory, the events leading up to the life of David, and that together these two works of unquestioned literary genius, the first works of literature in our tradition, the primal history of Israel as we find it in Genesis and Exodus and the early books of the Bible, and the life story of David as we find it in Samuel, taken together are the seed from which the Bible grows. And as the centuries passed and new books are added, new theological spin is added, the Bible begins to take the shape that we are familiar with and that we understand to be a single work. According to this theory, but for the life of David, there'd be no Bible. And but for the work of this authentic literary genius that we call the court historian, there would be no Bible. There is a way of decoding the Bible, the hidden meanings and references in the Bible, that gives credence to this theory. Some of these clues are very straightforward, and I'll share one with you. In the book of Genesis, very early in the book of Genesis, we are given a scene in which God enters into the covenant with Abraham, by which the Israelites are made God's chosen people. And the land of Canaan is promised to them as the promised land. And at that point, God says to Abraham, unto thy seed will I give this nation, from the river of Egypt to the far Euphrates. The river of Egypt, by the way, is not the Nile, it's the Wadi El Arish, which is a geological feature in the Sinai Peninsula, figured importantly in the 56 Sinai campaign and in the 73 war as well, and even back then was a significant landmark. The Bible tells us from the very beginning, God intended the promised land to stretch from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates River, which is in what is today distant Iraq, beyond Damascus. Once only in the history of ancient Israel did Israel reach these imperial dimensions, and only briefly, and that period, you will not be surprised to hear, was during the reign of David. The theory that's presented here is that we see in this divine promise to David a clue to the way this book was originally written, that someone living within those imperial borders, someone who witnessed the wars of conquest by which David created the kingdom of Israel, wished to backdate the legitimacy of those borders by putting them in the mouth of God, literally, as a promise to Abraham. Not before David and not after the reign of his son Solomon did Israel enjoy such borders. And that's one of the clues to understanding David's presence even in places in the Bible where his name is not mentioned. The other key to understanding the Bible code, which points to David, is a credo or a principle that I've already introduced to you. Wherever you find sex in the Bible, especially in the life story of David. The other side of the coin is always politics. Sex and politics are the axiomatic expressions of the function of David in history, of the destiny of David in the Bible. They are also the key to translating or to deciphering and decoding some of the clues I've talked to you about. Let me give you an example. Early in the book of Genesis, we are told about a tragic, heart-shaking incident of violence, which begins with the rape of a woman. Jacob, the patriarch, whose 12 sons are the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel, has one daughter. Her name is Dinah. The Bible tells us that at a time when Jacob and his sons were sojourners in the land of Canaan, they were settlers, living amid a native population, a hostile native population. I believe you will recognize, as I'm suggesting, the resonances with the modern political condition in Israel today. At this moment in history, Dinah goes out abroad in the land. She leaves her father's encampment. She encounters a Canaanite prince, his name is Shechem, who brutally rapes her. And then, at the moment that the rape is completed, falls mightily in love with her. And pleads with his father, the chieftain of this Canaanite tribe, to intercede on his behalf with Jacob and to obtain the hand in marriage of the woman he has just raped. And Jacob, significantly, is willing to do this deal. And it's presented in the Bible as an effort at peacemaking. It's the Oslo Accords of the distant biblical past. Jacob and Shechem's father engage in a negotiation in which they say, if our daughters and sons marry with each other, then we will build a relationship. We can live in peace with each other. The Israelites will not be confined to a narrow settlement within the land of Canaan. We can live throughout the land in peace with one another. And Jacob is perfectly willing to make this accommodation. Two of Jacob's sons, however, protest. These are Simeon and Levi, and they are outraged at the way their sister has been treated, and they're deeply uncomfortable with the idea of her marrying her rapist. And so they propose a ruse, a deception. I want you to keep that in mind too, because the expert at deception in the Bible is, in fact, David himself. This early example is a scheme worked by Simeon and Levi. They say, we will consent to our sister's marriage to Shechem, but only if he and his father and all the men of his community submit to circumcision, because it would be shameful for our sister to marry an uncircumcised man. And so smitten is Shechem with with Dinah, that he agrees to undergo circumcision. He convinces his father to do it, and his father, as the chieftain of the community, orders everyone else to do it. And so we have the scene of a mass adult circumcision of the community of Canaanites, all to implement this marriage. Simeon and Levi, however, had no intention of consenting to this marriage, and their demand for circumcision is just a ploy, because on the day after the circumcision, they rise early in the morning, they buckle on their swords, they enter the town where all of the men are abed, nursing this awkward and painful wound of adult circumcision in an era before anesthesia. And taking advantage of their disability, Simeon and Levi slay every man. They commit a mass murder of all the men of this community. This story, as shattering as it is, points directly, unambiguously, to the life of David. David, we are told, after the very famous scene in which he first comes to prominence as the slayer of Goliath, inspires love and adulation among everyone who beholds him. The women of Israel spontaneously pour into the streets, singing a song that literally drives the king of Israel mad with envy. Saul is the reigning king, and they sing, "Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Now, no man likes to be told that another man is 10 times the man he is, and not Saul. And it's at that moment that a bitter hatred towards David, a murderous hatred towards David, is inspired. But it's worse than that, because not only does the population come into the streets singing David's praises, literally, but his own children, his own adult children, fall in love with this man, this war hero. Not only Michal, his daughter, but even Jonathan, his son, both man and woman, fall in love with David. Saul wants to rid himself of this rival, and so he sets David a very peculiar and very calculating bride price. In ancient Israel, a man who was to marry had to pay a price to his future father-in-law for the hand of the daughter in marriage. This is called the mohar. David says, "I can't afford the bride price for a king's daughter. I'm a poor man." And Saul says, "Don't worry about silver or gold. All I want as a bride price are the foreskins of 100 Philistines." Now, what was Saul all about? Saul calculated that at least one of these Philistines was going to object to David performing an adult circumcision without the benefit of anesthesia, and would spare him, Saul, the duty or task of slaying David by doing it himself. So this incident in the life of David is prefigured, it's telegraphed to us by the mass circumcision in the story of Jacob and Dinah. In fact, David, who one scholar that I quote in my book calls the quintessential winner, is a winner even at this task. And not only does he survive the effort to collect 100 Philistine foreskins, but he brings 200. He's an overachiever. And in fact, he marries Michal. Let's go back to that story, another story in the book of Genesis that offers us a clue to the life of David and prefigures the life of David. We are told in the book of Genesis about the 12 sons of Jacob. The firstborn son is a man named Reuven. Under the law of primogeniture, under a biblical law that favors the firstborn, we would expect the eldest son to be the inheritor of the father's blessing and estate and position. We are told that Reuven forfeits his position, his rights as firstborn of Jacob, and we are only given one brief, fleeting sentence to explain why. It's a sentence that comes out of nowhere and goes nowhere, and stops us short in the narrative, as so many of these clues do. We are told only that Reuven, when his father Jacob was away, slips into the tent of his father's concubine, Bilhah, and sleeps with her. Commits the sin of incest with his father's wife. A concubine is the legal equivalent of a wife in biblical terms. This prefigures, as did the rape of Dinah, an event in the life of David. What we are told is that during David's lifetime, his son Absalom goes into rebellion against him, drives him from the throne, drives him barefoot and weeping over the Mount of Olives and into exile. And Absalom declares himself king in his father's place, enters the palace, and wears the crown. The Bible tells us that one of Absalom's counselors tells Absalom that he must make a public gesture of kingship to make it perfectly clear that he's the king now and not his father. And Absalom inquires as to what gesture the counselor had in mind. What he is told is that his father, David, had left in such haste against the threat of Absalom's insurrection, that he left behind the women of his harem, David, like other kings of the ancient world, maintained a harem of wives and concubines, and he left 10 women behind in the royal harem. The counselor proposes to him that a pavilion be erected on the roof of the palace, and that Absalom engage in an act of public sexual intercourse with each of these 10 women, one after another. And here we have as clear an example as I can give you of where sex and politics are two sides of the same coin. What is described in the Bible, you could characterize as a sex orgy, a public sex orgy, but it is strictly a political expression. It was an effort by Absalom to lay claim, irreversible, unmistakable claim to his father's crown by taking the king's concubines as his own. The incident is prefigured in the book of Genesis, and when it's presented to us in the book of Samuel, we can understand it as a political act rather than a sexual one. These are the expressions of a man who, at one level, is a sexual adventurer, you might even say a sexual predator. On the other hand, a man who is an expert politician, maneuvering to get and keep his crown and facing opposition from the most intimate places in his life, from the intimate circle of a highly dysfunctional family. Now, lest you feel that I am neglecting that important theological overlay that unmistakably is in the Bible, I want to concede that there were authors who came along later and embroidered this bold and sometimes brutal story of David with a theological apology or a theological explanation for the events in David's life. One of the crucial scenes in the Bible written into this narrative at a later date has to do with God's punishment of David for his sin with Bathsheba. It's a remarkable story. It also has a deeply political subtext. The prophet Nathan appears at the court of David after this scandalous affair with Bathsheba and tells him a parable, the parable of the rich man and the poor man. Now, I have to tell you that David is as sharp-minded and quick-witted a man as is depicted anywhere in the Bible. He's a man who is an expert at deception and deceit. He's a deeply political man, and yet at this moment he seems pretty thick and pretty out of it. He's clueless because he thinks that the story that Nathan is telling him, which is clearly presented as a parable, is an actual law case. Nathan tells the story of a rich man who has many lambs, and a poor man has but one lamb, and a traveler comes to town, and the rich man wants to make a meal for the traveler, but instead of slaughtering one of his many lambs of his own, he takes the one lonely little lamb of the poor man and slaughters it and dresses it, prepares it, and serves it to the stranger. And David, again, kind of clueless as to what's going on, is shown to say, that man, that wealthy man, must die because he committed a terrible sin by taking the only lamb of this poor man and not one of his own. And Nathan says in, again, one of these moments of poignance and eloquence and really moments of shock, Nathan says to the king, "Thou art the man." He accuses David and makes it clear that this is but a parable, and it is the gesture, the act of David in taking the only wife of Uriah that he means to identify by his parable. And he goes on to say that for this sin, God will punish him by, as Nathan puts it, raising evil out of your own house. And he says, what you did in secret, another man will do in the sight of all Israel. He is at that moment prophesying the insurrection of Absalom, the public act of sexual intercourse with the royal harem, the fact that time and time again from that point on, there are scandals within the intimate household of David that threaten his reign and his rule as king. But even that moment in the Bible is a bit of theological spin added later. And as I suggested at the outset of my talk, it's entirely possible to read the original story of King David as a man who did not turn to God, who was not the beneficiary of God's intervention, and in fact, by his own will and ruthlessness, prevailed against all of his enemies, starting with King Saul and ending with his own son Absalom, thus preserving his crown. The question that I'm often asked when I present David in such a harsh light, because I have to admit, you come away from these stories of David and in the original biblical biography with a certain ache, because we want to like David better than we do after we ponder how he really behaved and what his life really consisted of. And there has been a couple of thousands of years of theological effort to explain away and excuse what David plainly did according to the biblical evidence. I have characterized the Bible in my work as a censored book, frequently censored by priests and rabbis and ministers, by preachers and teachers who are deeply uncomfortable with precisely this dilemma. How could a man after God's own heart, a man identified in the Bible as the progenitor of the Messiah, how could he engage in voyeurism, exhibitionism, adultery, murder? And there is, even within the Bible, an example of censorship of the Bible, which is a specific response to this embarrassing fact, or these embarrassing facts. If you read this book of Samuel, you get the adult-rated version of the life story of David. You get the uncensored version in all of its sometimes lascivious detail. Several hundred years later, another biblical author came along, a priest, someone who was shocked and embarrassed and about the real life of David and wanted to do something about it. And he decided that he would retell the life story of David and leave out all those embarrassing details. He is the author of another book of the Bible, which we can find within our family Bibles, the book of Chronicles. If Samuel is the adult-rated version, Chronicles is the G-rated version, the child-safe version. No mention of Bathsheba and Uriah, no mention of Absalom's insurrection, no mention of any of the sordid and scandalous details of the life of David. But what I would submit to you is we are very fortunate that both books survived, and that the effort to censor David and to make him into a plaster saint was frustrated by the fact that the Hebrew Bible developed in a way that preserved both Samuel and Chronicles, so that we could behold David in all of his richness and sometimes troubling detail that's preserved in those original stories. I will say, by way of digression, that when Joe Lieberman made his first campaign appearance after being designated as the vice presidential nominee, a moment of great publicity focusing on the fact that he was the first Jewish person to be nominated by a major party. He fulfilled everyone's expectations, as you may recall, by uttering a public prayer and by quoting scripture. I found it very interesting, and now you'll understand why, that the book that he chose to quote was Chronicles, the censored book of the Bible, and certainly didn't pick anything from the lustier pages of the book of Samuel. In closing, I'm going to briefly read from the closing passages of my book, where I attempt to strike what you might call the moral bottom line on this troubling David. And then I'd be delighted to invite you to ask questions or share comments with me for a short discussion. Exactly what are we meant to learn from King David as he is depicted in the Bible? Once we have read his biblical life story with open eyes, and once we have witnessed the shocking excesses of which he was capable, some of us may be left with the idea that he does not really belong in a book that holds itself out as a source of moral instruction for humankind. One clue to the mystery is the very word that the Bible uses to describe David. He is, first and always, a man, or if you prefer to use a gender-neutral translation of the Hebrew text, a human being. Even though the Bible insists on praising God above all, the deeply humanistic notion that man is the measure of all things is spoken out loud by David himself in Psalm 8, where he asks God a crucial question: what is man that thou art mindful of him? And then answers it in a way that affirms the primacy of humankind on earth. Yet thou hast made him but little lower than angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. David, of course, cannot be readily credited with the profound compassion or the fierce sense of social justice that inspired the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. But if we look beyond the brutal deathbed instructions that he issued to Solomon, his last charge to his beloved son seems to strike something of the same note. "Be thou strong," said David to Solomon, "and show thyself a man." If we render the same phrase with a bit of Yiddish, we may come closer to understanding what God expected of David, what God expects of all of us, or at least what we ought to expect of ourselves. Be a mensch. Thank you so much for allowing me to share these thoughts with you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take questions. You can approach one of the mics, or if you don't want to do that, we have a boom mic that we can use. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. My question comes from the book of 2 Samuel.
Yes.
Where in chapter 7, about verse 16, God speaking to King David through the prophet Nathan, and says to King David that your dynasty and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. How do you see this prophecy being fulfilled?
This is a very important question.
And why or why not would you see it the way that the church sees it, as being fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth?
Well, I'm going to grapple with both those questions, and these are very important questions. The Bible is a book of contracts, of covenants between God and human beings. All of the covenants in the Bible in the Hebrew Bible, are if-then propositions. The covenant between God and Abraham, the covenant between God and Moses, is an if-then proposition. If you heed my law, if you obeyed my law, then I will bless you. If you fail to obey my law, then I will curse you. Once and only once is God shown to make an unequivocal, unconditional promise, and that's a promise to David. And as this gentleman has pointed out, the prophet Nathan approaches David and communicates to him the promise that he and his dynasty will reign forever. No matter what sins they commit, the blessing will never be withdrawn from them. This is what one scholar calls, as I quote in my book, the theological highlight of the book of Samuel. However, history proved that promise to be wrong. The dynasty of David lasted for nearly 500 years. It was the longest continuous dynasty in the ancient world, but it did come to an end. It came to an end with the Babylonian conquest, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the exile of the intelligentsia and aristocracy of the kingdom of Judah. No human being with David's blood, reigned in Israel after that event. Now we are presented with a problem. How do we reconcile, how do we understand the unconditional promise that's put in God's mouth with the fact that David's line, David's dynasty, comes to an end? And it is precisely at that moment that the promise is subtly reinterpreted in light of history. By necessity, the theologians whose work is reflected in the later books of the Bible say the promise does not mean that a human king with David's blood will always reign in Jerusalem, but one day, after the human dynasty has come to an end, a Messiah will come, a Redeemer will come, and in his veins will flow the blood of David. And that's what God meant by the promise of eternal kingship. And the questioner, the gentleman who came to the microphone, makes a very crucial point. About this point, both Jews and Christians agree. They agree on very little else in their theology, but both Christian and Jewish tradition holds that the Messiah will be a descendant of David. In the Christian tradition, this has been specifically understood to mean that Jesus of Nazareth is a direct descendant of David, thus fulfilling the promise of God. And in fact, the Gospels give a genealogy, a detailed genealogy of Jesus' descent from David. In Jewish tradition, we are awaiting the coming of this Messiah. We wait still, but it is a tenet of Judaism that, as the rabbis put it, if the Messiah comes from the dead, it will be the resurrected David. And if the Messiah comes from the living, it will be someone in whose veins David's blood flows. Now, the only thing I can say in final answer to your question is that's exactly the point at which Judaism and Christianity diverge, and it is the essential difference that Christians understand the promise of eternal kingship and messiahship to have been fulfilled in Jesus, and Jews do not. That's the defining difference between the two theologies. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Professor Hecht, I call on you.
Jonathan, this is a very interesting interpretation that you've given, and I enjoyed it very much. And but what is the reason for it? I mean, in other words, are they just, as you suggested early on, just the court historian who is just moved by this extraordinary figure of David and writes this down, and that comes to be known after subsequent expansions, perhaps as 1st and 2nd Samuel, the book of Samuel? Or may there have been a larger purpose? And I want to challenge you and to suggest that it's not that the authors of the biblical text wanted to just sort of show you this wild character, David, with all of these contradictions and expositions, but actually there's a political and theological point that is being made through David, at least at this early level, and that is when the people press Samuel to make a king for them, like all the other nations round about them, God responds to Samuel and say, hey, Samuel, don't be too upset about this. They haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. Now, the first experiment in kingship is a dismal failure with Saul, and you alluded to that. But what seems to happen next is this just depressing picture in which God is absent. And that's why, I mean, in that sense, the people have rejected him, he's gone. And what is very interesting, I think, is that this court historian, as the scholars call him, and his associate, maybe the Yavist, write a very dismal picture that is a kind of secularist view of the early years of the monarchy. And so it's really a much more weighty issue, which is, where's God? Why has God withdrawn himself from the affairs of the nation that he has proven, or he has promised to guide?
I will concede, and I feel compelled to concede that you have just, in the last words you spoke, articulated the basic friction that creates heat and light in the Bible. The friction between what God is understood to have promised and how history unfolded. I also want to say that according to the famous old saying, history is written by the victors, and in a sense, the Bible is written by the victors. And in this case, it's not the victors of battles or in political terms. The victors in the long history of ancient Israel were the priests and scribes who were the guardians of the religion of ancient Israel. And so within the Bible, as you have pointed out so crucially, it's a very important point, there is a real hostility towards kings and worldly politics. And the scene that you have described, which I would suggest is a much later layer of narrative overwritten to the original narrative, but the scene you described is a crucial scene. The people come to the prophet Samuel and they say, "Make us a king just like everyone else." And it breaks Samuel's heart and it breaks God's heart, because the Israelites were not supposed to be like everyone else. They were supposed to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And it's almost like God is punishing the Israelites by giving them what they want. You want a king, you'll get a king. And Samuel delivers a speech which could have been something out of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. He delivers a speech about how terrible kings are and all the terrible things they do to their people. The bottom line, as I see it, is that after this long, complex, subtle process of authorship with so many contending points of view, the Bible ends up in the custodianship of the most pious among the intelligentsia of ancient Israel, and they put the final theological polish on the story and thus leave it the way we find it, which always credits God for every victory. For instance, I've proposed that you could read David's successes as the result of his own skill and drive and ambition, but the Bible says over and over again, the Lord was with David wherever he went, and thus he had victories. Yes, sir.
There was a notion that with King David, that was the first time that there was a separation between religion and state. I want you to tell us a little bit if you thought about this point.
One of the exciting things you learn when you study how these texts have been interpreted is the idea that David invented what we understand to be biblical Israel, that he instituted the organs of government, the rituals, the titles that came to be the monarchy of ancient Israel. And you could make the argument that that's the dividing line between a point in the history of Israel where it was purely a theocracy. It was ruled by holy men and women called in the Bible judges or prophets. They were equivalent, if you'll forgive the analogy, to an ayatollah. They were a religious leader. They were governing from the stance of a religious figure. And David comes along and he is not a priest. He's not a prophet. He replaces that line of authority with what we would understand to be political and military authority. And so an argument can very readily be made, as you have suggested, that among the many things that I have proposed start with David, psychology and politics and literature and biography, one of the things that starts with David is the idea that countries are governed by secular leaders who are of political and military stature, and that they take advice from priests and prophets, but they do not share power with them. By all means.
This will be the end.
Go ahead.
Would you please comment on the symbolic and historical references of the Star of David, including references to the Kabbalah?
I'd be delighted. Let me see if I can find, I deal with this in my book. And I can efficiently handle the answer to that question by reading you a short paragraph by way of conclusion. It's a very interesting paragraph, too. Even the so-called, and the point, this comes in a section where we talk about what we do and don't know about the historical David. In fact, we do have strong archaeological evidence uncovered only 7 years ago, written in stone, that evidences the human existence of David. But much else about David is made up. The tomb of David in Jerusalem today is not the tomb of the human David. The Tower of David was built by Herod, and the Star of David has nothing whatever to do with David. Even the so-called Star of David, the symbol that has come to signify Judaism in general and the modern state of Israel in particular, has no real connection with King David, whether we regard him as a biblical or a historical figure. This distinctive six-pointed star first came to be associated with David among alchemists and magic users in medieval Christian and Islamic circles. And early Jewish sources linked the star sometimes to David, sometimes to Solomon, sometimes to neither of them. The earliest written references to the shield of David, Mogen David, as the six-pointed star is known in Jewish usage, dates only to the 14th century. And it was not until the 19th century, the very late 19th century, that the Star of David came to be adopted by the Jewish community as, and I am quoting, a striking and simple sign which would symbolize Judaism in the way that the cross symbolizes Christianity. I guess we're out of time, and I thank you once again for allowing me to share the Bible.